June 1944. Somewhere in occupied France, a railway laborer finishes a modest lunch and wipes his hands on his trousers. He steps behind a signal hut, just far enough from view, and takes a small brass tube from his pocket. With the heel of his boot, he crushes one end. Inside, something fragile snaps. There is no smoke, no sound, no spark. He kneads the tube into a lump of gray explosive putty, presses it neatly against a joint beneath the rail, dusts his hands clean, and walks home. 3 hours later, while he is seated at dinner with his family, a German Knight Express tears through the countryside 6 miles away and leaves the tracks in a storm of steel and fire. When German investigators arrive at the wreck, they find nothing that explains what happened. No wires, no clockwork, no obvious trigger, only twisted iron, shattered timber, and a few scattered flecks of brass no larger than pencil shavings. This scene was repeated hundreds of times. Across France in the hours before the Normandy landings, post-war Special Operations Executive reports list a staggering number of successful rail disruptions that single night, with widely cited figures placing the total at 577 separate cuts. Locomotives were destroyed by the dozens, rail yards crippled, bridges weakened, signaling systems wrecked, entire routes went dark. Supply lines that the German High Command relied upon simply ceased to function. One elite SS armored division, moving toward Normandy at the moment of invasion, was delayed for roughly 2 weeks by an invisible war fought by farmers, clerks, and mechanics. The tool that made this possible was so ordinary in appearance that it invited dismissal. It resembled nothing more dangerous than something a schoolchild might carry to class. The British named it the time pencil. The Germans would come to know it as a device they could never fully understand or defeat by 1940. British intelligence faced a paradox. Across occupied Europe, millions were willing to resist German rule, but almost none possessed the means to strike effectively without courting immediate death. Conventional explosives demanded dangerously close placement. Mechanical timers were complicated, fragile, and often betrayed their operators with an audible ticking. Electrical detonators required batteries that degraded in cold barns or damp basements. Even when such equipment could be delivered by parachute, it required technical knowledge far beyond the skills of most civilian resistance fighters. What London needed was not a marvel of engineering, but the opposite. A device so simple that almost anyone could use it, so silent it could survive a body search, and so reliable it could be hidden for months and still work. That solution began to take shape at a quiet country estate near Stevenage, in Hertfordshire. Requisitioned by the government and stripped of any sign of its previous life, it became known simply as Station 12. There, behind high fences and under strict secrecy, scientists and engineers assembled the tools of Europe's hidden war. Among them was Lieutenant Commander A.J.G. Langley, a naval officer and engineer who would later be officially credited with one of the most important sabotage devices of the conflict. His goal was deceptively modest: build a delay fuse that required no power source, no moving clockwork, and no specialized knowledge to operate. The result was elegant in its brutality. The finished device measured 5 inches long and just under 3/8 of an inch thick, precisely matching the dimensions of an ordinary writing pencil. The casing was brass. Inside, the mechanism consisted of only a few critical elements: a narrow copper tube housing a glass vial filled with a corrosive chemical, a thin restraining wire, a spring-loaded steel striker held under tension, and a percussion cap at the base. There were no gears, no wiring, no switches. Activation required only a squeeze. When the copper section was crushed with pliers or the sole of a boot, the glass vial broke. The liquid inside flooded the wire and began to eat through it. When corrosion finally weakened the wire enough to snap, the spring drove the striker into the percussion cap. The cap ignited the detonator. The detonator set off the main charge. From start to finish, the countdown was entirely silent. What made the time pencil revolutionary was not merely its simplicity, but its adaptability. Different versions were filled with different concentrations of corrosive solution, producing a range of delays. To avoid confusion in the field, Sol adopted a removable, color-coded safety tag system. Black indicated a brief 10-minute delay, used only for training. Red provided a half. White gave 2 hours. Green offered approximately 5.5 hours. Yellow stretched to 12. Blue extended the delay a full day. Agents memorized the colors and destroyed the tags after arming the device so that German investigators would gain no insight into the system, yet even chemistry had its quirks. Reaction speed varied dramatically with temperature. So manuals included detailed correction tables, warning agents that what worked in a mild English spring would behave very differently in a Russian winter or North African heat. A red 30-minute fuse could stretch beyond an hour at sub-zero temperatures, or shrink to less than 10 minutes in extreme heat. Some operatives adjusted successfully, others miscalculated, with fatal consequences. Still, the advantages far outweighed the risks. The first major demonstration of the time pencil's potential came in June 1941 near Bordeaux. Free French agents targeted the transformer station at Pestac, a critical supplier of electricity to U-boat bases and war industry. In a single coordinated operation, magnetic incendiary charges fitted with time pencils were placed on 8 transformers. The men were gone in under half an hour. When the devices fired, 6 of the 8 transformers were destroyed. Power to the Italian submarine base at Bordeaux collapsed for weeks. Electric rail networks were crippled and forced back to steam. Full repairs dragged on for more than a year. Hugh Dalton, Britain's Minister of Economic Warfare, later wrote to Churchill that such precision attacks were achieving results bombing could not. 2 years later, that logic was tested again in a more ethically fraught setting, the Peugeot factory at Sarre. In July 1943, Royal Air Force bombers attacked the facility, killing over 100 French civilians while leaving production largely intact. SOE Captain Harry reproposed a different approach. He made contact with the factory's management and delivered an ultimatum: cooperate with targeted sabotage using clandestine explosives, or face continued bombing from the air. The factory owners chose cooperation. Detailed blueprints were quietly passed to the resistance. In November, agents and trusted workers placed plastic explosives with time pencils on compressors and electrical transformers inside the plant. The factory was shut down. No civilians were killed. RAF bombing ceased. It was a brutal but persuasive illustration of how a handful of hidden devices could outperform entire bomber squadrons. The time pencil reached its moment of historic importance on the night of June 5, 1944, as coded messages crackled across BBC airwaves. Resistance networks across France activated a vast, coordinated sabotage plan designed to isolate Normandy on the eve of invasion. Rail lines were cut simultaneously across regions. Within the first 24 hours, hundreds of breaks had been reported. In southeastern France alone, more than 50 locomotives were disabled in a single day. By June 7th, the rail network feeding German forces into Normandy was in chaos. For the remainder of the summer, long-distance transport across France remained unreliable, crippled by repeated interruptions. Among the architects of this disruption was Perlwith, one of the few women to command a major resistance network. Her circuit, numbering in the thousands, executed hundreds of rail attacks between Paris and Bordeaux. The Germans placed a substantial bounty on her head. Her fighters inflicted heavy casualties and, by war's end, oversaw the surrender of tens of thousands of enemy troops. When she was later offered a civilian honor for her services, she refused it, stating plainly that there had been nothing civil about what she had done. The strategic consequences of the sabotage became starkly visible in the fate of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. Stationed in southern France at the time of the landings, the division possessed hundreds of tanks and should have reached Normandy within days. Instead, its rail transport collapsed under systematic sabotage. Flat cars were quietly disabled, axles seized, bridges failed, fuel lines were cut. Forced onto the roads, the division became prey to ambushes and demolitions at every turn. What should have been a 3-day journey stretched to more than 2 weeks. When the division finally arrived near the front, the Normandy beachhead was already secure. For all its impact, the time pencil baffled German analysts. Thousands were captured during the war. Yet the Wehrmacht never adopted a comparable chemical delay system for widespread use. German ordnance doctrine favored precise mechanical and electrical timing systems devices suitable for military engineers, not civilians. What they failed to grasp was that the genius of the time pencil lay in its very lack of refinement. It required no expertise, no maintenance, no infrastructure. Anyone who could follow 2 sentences of instruction could use it. It turned ordinary people into invisible combatants. Ironically, some of the captured devices were diverted into one of the most famous assassination attempts in history. In March 1943, German officers opposing Hitler obtained British delay fuses through clandestine channels. A bomb disguised as liquor bottles was placed aboard Hitler's aircraft. The fuse was crushed as designed, yet the unheated cargo compartment at high altitude proved too cold. The striker never fired. Later that same year, the remaining explosives and British fuses were used in the July 20th plot at the Wolf's Lair. This time the mechanism functioned exactly as intended. Hitler survived only because the briefcase containing the bomb was moved behind a heavy table support moments before detonation. Production numbers reflected the extraordinary confidence placed in the device. An initial batch of several thousand units entered service in 1939, barely weeks after the war began. By the summer of 1940, tens of thousands had been issued to Britain's clandestine stay-behind units, preparing for a possible German invasion. Over the course of the war, manufacturing ran into the millions. Some estimates place total production as high as 12 million units. Each one represented a hidden countdown, a future explosion waiting patiently inside Barna's basements and hedgerows across Europe. The broader implications were profound. Unlike conventional warfare, which concentrated violence into massive, visible engagements, the time pencil turned war into a quiet, dispersed, and uncontrollable phenomenon. Sabotage required no uniforms, no formations, no public declarations. A railway worker could become an executioner of steel during his lunch break and return home unnoticed. German occupation forces responded with patrols, searches, and reprisals. But they could never locate a front line to suppress. Every village became suspect, every laborer a potential saboteur. The device did not merely destroy infrastructure, it eroded the occupier's sense of control. When assessed beside the grand machinery of the Second World War, tanks, bombers, battleships, and rockets, the time pencil appears almost absurd. It was 5 inches of brass, a glass vial of acid, a spring, and a cap. Yet its strategic effect rivaled that of entire air campaigns. It enabled precision at a scale impossible for mass bombing. It made logistics unstable. It delayed divisions. It spared civilians by allowing factories and rail lines to be disabled surgically rather than annihilated from the sky. It reshaped how sabotage was understood and practiced. More than anything, the time pencil stands as a reminder that technological dominance is not always a product of complexity. The Germans possessed some of the most advanced engineering of the age. The British, in this case, chose reductive simplicity. A device that could be crushed under a boot heel proved more disruptive than many machines crafted in precision workshops. It worked not because it was sophisticated, but because it was accessible. It transformed civilians into strategic actors and gave shape to a shadow war that occupation forces could neither anticipate nor suppress. In the end, the time pencil did not win the war by itself, but it altered the conditions under which the war was fought in occupied Europe. It allowed resistance movements to operate at a scale that would otherwise have been impossible. It amplified the impact of Allied invasions. It redirected bombing campaigns. It forced the enemy to fight not only armies but entire populations, and it did so without ever revealing its presence until the moment steel tore itself apart. A railway line, intact at dusk, lay in fragments by dawn. A tank division, ready to move, found itself stranded. A factory, humming with forced labor one day, sat dark the next, and the men and women responsible had already blended back into the crowded anonymity of occupation. The Germans had their armored divisions, their dive bombers, their rockets aimed at distant cities. The British, quietly, had a pencil.